hip-hop history is riddled with monumental moments that have shifted the culture of how capitalism enacts growth in the midst of black people. And I feel the precedence with how rap came to separate itself from other so-called genres is its sheer openness to being a willing contender, or rather a willing recipient to this idea of competition. Musicians have always been competitive. If not overtly so, there's a culture of a deep-seated need to kind of outdo each other while learning from each other. This is natural. This is the way things develop as they find edges and pockets of new possibilities. And of course, hip-hop, with rap being its strand that broke into the capitalist machine so successfully, is no different. When we talk about GOATs, we often talk about the people whose success has really gleaned on their ability to become the most viciously competitive MC. The one who outdid everybody through their own particular set of skills. And intentionally so. So much so, rap is pretty much the only artistic space where the competition embeds itself in the content. Where rappers rap against other rappers purely just for sports most of the time. And what this has done to the culture, I think, as VJ, is that it's created this assumption that that's what rap is to the core. You're not rapping if you're not trying to outdo anybody. Is this the case? Is hip-hop, and by virtue of that, rap, inherently competitive? Or is this something we kind of fed from the obvious capitalist mentality of having to beat your competitors? I want to ask this question using one of the greatest, if not the greatest rappers who have ever touched a mic. And who ironically is not a key factor in a lot of these GOAT conversations. A rapper who recently was honored by BET for his achievement in the culture, for his impact as a musician and artist. I'm talking about none other than Busta Bust. Definitely one of the golden era's most influential MCs. Many might say the most influential MC. Many might even say the GOAT. However, the many who might say he is the GOAT don't often translate into the public discourse of the GOAT itself. When you hear people's top fives, you hear the typical names that have rang in the ears of a hip-hop head and a pop culture head's knowledge of who the most successful rappers are. From the kind of archetypes of lyricism and breaking into the pop stream while still remaining true to poetic device. People like Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, KRS-One, going into the more 90s lists that involve the Jiggers, the Nas, and then of course the controversy around Eminem. These are the names that are constantly featured. Now, going into this late millennial age, you hear Drake's, Kendrick Lamar's, J. Cole's being thrown out in there. And it seems that there's a constant thread that could connect every MC who people regard as a GOAT. And that's, at some point in their career, they openly flirted with and engaged with this idea of challenging other rappers purely for sport. They put themselves out there as elite MCs and vocalized it and challenged anybody who didn't quite agree with that. This is embellished in all of their careers. And this becomes a fundamental part of why a lot of people think rap is inherently competitive. Now here comes Busta Rhymes, who even in his award acceptance speech mentions how he was always been reluctant to be solo and in the front and to take on the responsibilities of a solo MC. He's always seen himself and thus characterized his whole approach to the art as a team player, as somebody who's there to add what they do, and they know that they're great in their own way, and then move back and watch the pieces fall together perfectly. Now, I think that's a crucial part of why Busta Rhymes, ironically enough, might be the greatest of all time. It's the unconventional approach to not saying you're the GOAT, but just being it. It's the question of whether or not we're missing the point and we're actually misrepresenting hip-hop itself when we say it is inherently competitive. So this is the conversation I think Busta reminds us all of, and this is the kind of approach that he turns around to challenge us with. He says, don't forget that in its inception, hip-hop was born out of the spirit of collective agency. People helping each other to thrive together from the conditions that affect all of them. And so, even in the block party, as the elements began to fragment themselves, it was always part of this greater whole. The DJ knew that as skillful as they were, they owed their skill to the response of the audience. This is how they gauged the impact of how good they were. So it's a dialogue. There is no DJ without an audience. There is no breaker, b-boy or girl, without this response from people, without learning from other breakers. There is no graffiti artist without interacting together, moving in troops, learning from each other's styles. And most importantly, there is no rapper without this key dialogue of the audience, without the DJ, without the graph artist inspiring the atmosphere. So if we're being honest, hip-hop isn't inherently competitive. Capitalism is. Because capitalism extracted rap and turned it into its own media making machine. One of the core things that it had to do was make rap competitive. And how do you do that? How do you take an art form which was born as a tool to empower each other and turn it around into a tool to outdo each other? You do that by setting rappers against each other. And now we see that through the history of how rap has been documented in the media. Terms like underground and commercial hip-hop don't come from hip-hop. They were terms journalists created to differentiate the spaces in which different rappers were coming up and the decisions they were making to either be part of a major label or to try and funnel in a more independent route. Terms like gangster rap as opposed to conscious rap were labels created by journalists to ideologically separate so-called rappers who were about social upliftment and those whose material was street-based. So what I'm trying to say is each and every divisive, competitive term and thus idea you think was born from hip-hop was actually not born from hip-hop at all. It was born around people who were documenting the culture through a lens that they were very deliberate about. This capitalist competitive lens. So the next time you call a rapper a backpacker and you call somebody else a conscious cat, remember that these terms do not come from hip-hop. They come from journalists who wanted to confuse you about hip-hop and segment it in a way in which it could fit into neat markets. Because the reality of how rappers moved in their art is they were for the streets and for the cause. Whether you're talking about NWA, Wu-Tang Clan, or the most so-called gangster rapper you can think of, they have a compilation of songs that addressed the key issues which were plaguing their communities. And let's flip it to invert it. You can think of the most quote-unquote conscious artist, and they have songs dedicated to their own lust for women, to being in the club. As pandering as some of these cats tended to be because of certain religious and socio-political ideas that they staunchly held, and this hostility towards hypermaterialism, which they really resented, they were never against the streets. And thus they were never against narrators of the streets, and they were never against cats who came from a life where the streets were the center of what they did. So let's go into this idea by first understanding that a lot of the things we think are hip-hop are actually not hip-hop at all. And because they're not hip-hop at all, that makes them capitalist. So again, this idea that we have that the GOATs are rappers who openly compete with other rappers in order to show their dominance on the mic, and every rapper should have at least a couple of tracks where he's dissing somebody, where he's overtly challenging the game in order to kind of earn that throne. Is this a quality of hip-hop? Hell no, it isn't a quality of hip-hop. So what do you say, VJ, then about the art of battle rap? How does that factor into it? This is exactly why a lot of battle rappers don't easily transcend into greater acts. Because battle rap as a niche is so focused on this art of competitive rapping that it limits its capacity to grow. And this is not going to be an episode about the politics of battle rap. We can do that later on. It's merely a segue into reflecting on the fact that Busta Rhymes is the most consistent at not challenging anybody directly, but challenging himself, constantly growing, allowing other MCs to mold his style, openly talking about how other rappers influence the way that he approaches his rhyming pattern, openly telling us that he's not afraid to learn from younger MCs, openly showing us that he's willing to collaborate with anybody who's challenging themselves also. And this is why he's remained relevant. So maybe Busta Rhymes is not only the GOAT, but the only GOAT. Because if that is the root of what hip-hop was born in, seems to me that Busta Rhymes is the only rapper who reflects the true spirit of hip-hop. Everybody else is just reflecting the spirit of capitalism. The spirit of the competitive edge. The spirit of get one up against the person next to you. While Busta Rhymes has consistently been about us. If I am going to succeed, it is through working with my brothers and my sisters and everything in between. We see this also in his camaraderie, companionship, brotherhood with Spliff Star. How Busta and Spliff have taken this art form and relationship of the rapper and the hype man to levels that are beyond just somebody shadowing an MC's performance and giving him fillers to where he tires and kind of being his energetic complementary device. Spliff Star is an extension of Busta's performance, and as a result, Busta Rhymes, even in the way he presents hip-hop, is showing us that it isn't about you. Just like a musician would say, We've got my man so-and-so on the drums.
You know, it's funny that in this modern day, hype men are shunned, or people who don't matter. And you know, Splipstar is epitomized ukuthi a hype man is actually part of the act.
Part of the act. In the same way that musicians would say, I've got my man so-and-so on the drums. I got my girl so-and-so on the bass. To show that even in the performance, the art is always a collective experience. Busta Rhymes seemingly is the only MC who shows us that hip-hop, first and foremost, is about collective agency. In a time where the phrase, did it all on my own, seems to be a very common thing in the rap world. In a time where saying no new friends is a popular slang phrase. In a time where almost seeming like you popped out of a vacuum into your own success is the way that a lot of rappers present themselves. But here comes Busta, openly showing that that could never be the case. So I'm here to make a case about how that qualifies Busta as the only GOAT. And that maybe we need to reconsider our idea of GOAT. Maybe media conglomerates, the headspace included, are part of the problem. Because we're playing into the idea of GOAT through the competitive lens. Maybe the 5 principles work in conjunction with a more collective outlook. These are questions. Because Busta Rhymes is great enough to have made me constantly challenge myself, even in the ways that I present the content to you, the viewer. So let's take this moment to not only honor Busta for the years he's put in and how he's consistently been so interesting throughout these years, but let's actually look at how he's been doing that. He's been doing it through openly working with others. And this is the same reason I argue that he is not epitomized as being better than everybody else. This is why it is so hard to put Busta in your top 5, because his work resists it. While his skill, his dominance, his overall catalog doesn't. It's a conundrum, isn't it? But it's an interesting one. Because it really shows us that at the end of the day, when we start working with each other, we become so powerful that there is no one person who gets all the credit. And maybe this is the world we need to start living in. Maybe Busta Rhymes is truly showing us the shape of things that not only are to come, but should have come and should actively be working in our DNA as we live and breathe and think. Maybe we're so obsessed with the cult of the one person, this Messiah, the savior of anything, that we've injected it into hip-hop, into rap. That rap always needs a savior. There's always somebody who needs to become dominant over every other MC. And maybe this is the problem. Maybe this idea of the GOAT as the greatest of all time by a competitive lens, the GOAT as greater than everybody else, is what is holding rap and as a result hip-hop back. And I think Busta Rhymes is the archetype of how we begin to ask this question. My name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother. And the last note I can say is, if you've been listening to this conversation and you disagree with me, please talk to me in the comment section. If you agree, please do the same. Point is, let's move in this collective agency, because if the headspace is to be great, it is going to be through you. If the work that Keza and I and Fritz do as the headspace is going to truly impact hip-hop in Africa, it's going to be through the collective agency we all display as we engage in dialogue and we help shape what this becomes. And as a result, maybe then, greatness is a state of things as they happen amongst each other, not a quality that can be displayed by an individual. Peace.